Pardon the interruption. My name is Sam Mulberry, and I am joined by
Amy Poppinga.
And Chris Gehrz.
Guys, we are to the end of Unit 2. I always feel like we hit this point and the class just sort of takes off and flies by, and Unit 3 goes even faster. But before we get to Unit 3, we want to spend some time reviewing Unit 2. The second half of Unit 2 starts with the rebirth of Western culture in Italian cities like Florence and Rome. Amy, can you tell us a little bit about why the Renaissance is a significant chapter in the story of CWC?
Yeah, the Renaissance to me is sort of the chapter in the book where you're like, oh, look, there's all these pictures in here. Oh, yay. I mean, I really kind of mean that in the sense that we see in some respects, like we see people like living these full and active lives, quote again. And this feels, I'm reading everything through the context of our current situation. So I'm going to tell you right now, friends, I'm waiting for the Renaissance to come along because it's feeling a little bit too, too much that we're stuck in the crises of the last couple centuries. But the Renaissance is significant because it is this time period where emerging out of, we have the High Middle Ages, then we have all of these crises that occur that kind of knock us back down as humanity on our, knock us sort of back down to the ground again. And then we get up again. And not only do we get up again, but crisis leads to innovation. And when I teach this in a different class, I always talk about how like crisis leads to innovation. The innovation carries us into the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is the reflection of all of kind of these new innovations in the way that we do life, innovations in the way that we think about life, and we think about the purpose of life, this idea of who am I supposed to be? And then we see people like creatively and impressively sort of living that out. So a couple of things to note. I'm not going to say a lot right here in the answer about like the details of the Renaissance because we have this amazing Renaissance museum. And if we even think about comparatively like the experience you might have as students with like the Renaissance as opposed to say the Middle Ages, we have in many respects like a lot more for you to work with. And this should right away tell us some key factors that I want to just like highlight, which is this is a period of stability. It's an emerging and lasting stability. So this means that people feel relatively safe. They feel safe not only actually like in physical daily life, and we see this through the investments that they're making in architecture, the investments that they're making in the expansion and say things like trade, moving around, moving outside of their immediate geographic location, and traveling to other places. And then as a result of that, engaging with other cultures, engaging in trade, bringing things into new spaces, bringing things back into their own. But when we look at the artwork of this time, it's all represented there, that people have a very high view of humanity's potential. And so when we see that happen in history, again, that points to this, to me, like real security and stability. And also kind of this interesting, which is something I've been reading about lately, almost this sort of like, we're almost a little bit superhuman. Like we've lived through a really difficult period. We've come up with ways of being, of surviving, and not only surviving, but we also see this as a period of thriving. And so there is this safety and security that translates also into what we think our lives are supposed to mean. We envision longer lives for ourselves. My life has a purpose. What am I going to do with it? And how am I going to creatively work that out? And so we see that in things like experimentation, some new types of scientific experimentation, the beginnings of exploration, which has a whole ugly dark side. But if we're just sort of talking here about this through the European lens of the Renaissance, so it is a period of transition, but it's also a period of transition into a new home that in many respects we still live in. So it's not like a rest stop. It's not like a way station, if you will. As we move on to something new, we still actually very much sort of live with the ideals of the Renaissance. And in particular, one of the vocabulary words that we ask you to think about, this notion of being an homo universale, like a whole and complete person that, this morning I took a walk, and then we're going to do this webisode. And then when I'm done with this webisode, I'm probably going to go make a painting while I paint it, while I bake a bundt cake. And that actually is a lot of what life looks like right now. But the point being that like we are people who can achieve in multiple different areas. So, and I always feel this need to defend the Renaissance because CWC has this long history of a sordid relationship with it. Sometimes we think it doesn't matter or it's boring. But I like it again because it's like we've been doing all of this heavy lifting and then we get, like I said, to the chapter with some pictures.
I think it's really just me who has the sort of, so I'll go ahead and I'll speak out in favor of the Renaissance here, since I don't always do that. I mean, I think you're right, Amy. I think there's a lot to admire about the Middle Ages. We talked about that in the last webisode, but it does feel constricted and maybe a little bit stifling, right? Like, and as it falls apart in the 14th and the 15th century, it's kind of remarkable. You get this, rebirth, but people actually think about human flourishing, which is an idea I think we just take for granted. Jay Barnes just retired from Bethel, right? And I think students, if you've been to Bethel for a year or more, you might have heard Jay talk about taking a trip to Alaska and coming to Mount Denali and seeing like a little bit of it. And then the guide said, no, you have to look higher, right? And that was Jay's way of talking about, you should think about the transformative experience in education. I don't know if you would view it this way, but that's a pretty Renaissance sort of ideal. We assume humans are made for something pretty great, whatever your calling is. And part of our job as professors then is to challenge you students to kind of look higher. And the Renaissance is giving us that sort of notion of what it means to be human. And that has problems with it too, but I think that's, I'm glad for that kind of optimistic chapter in Western history.
Yep, for sure. One piece of the story that we'll come back to in Unit 3 is the advent of European empire. Chris is our resident European historian. Why is it significant that the Renaissance and Reformation both overlap with European conquests in the Western Hemisphere? Like we've got these multiple stories going on. Why do we need to pay attention to that and kind of understand these stories? It's being interwoven.
Yeah, it's always hard. I mean, basically, this is kind of a linear narrative we're telling, right? This happens and this happens. And then we get to like the 1400s, and there are 2 or 3 really big stories happening, and it's always hard for us to know kind of where to tell them. And so the story of what Europeans are going to call the Age of Discovery and what other peoples will experience as the Age of Oppression and Genocide, frankly, is starting in the 1400s. So it's the Portuguese and then the Spanish moving out into the Atlantic, into the Indian Ocean, and hitting the Western Hemisphere. Now, I mean, in a sense, like European empire is nothing new, right? I mean, we started the class talking about the Greeks and the Romans, and Christendom is a kind of empire. And during the Crusades, there's European empire in the Middle East. There's a whole European colony called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I think what's really important about this, let me do a Lindbergh thing, which I'll try not to do too often, but I just finished the book, so it's on my mind. Charles Lindbergh, like right in the run-up to World War II, writes a lot about Western civilization, and he uses it synonymously with what he calls the white race. And I think that's a really important effect that's happening here, that West is becoming synonymous with white as we get into the 15th, 16th century. Now, I mean, it's very controversial among ancient medieval historians, like, is race a later invention? Was it always there? Did the Romans and Greeks think in these terms? And there's a lot of debate in those fields right now about how white supremacists use ancient and medieval history to kind of buttress their sense of the white race. But it's important because you've got Europeans, what we call Western culture, now encountering other civilizations that don't have this shared history, that look different from them. And they exploit them, and they oppress them, and they enslave them, and they kill them. And eventually, we'll talk about in the Enlightenment, they use racism to justify this. They construct different categories of people to say that indigenous persons in the Western Hemisphere don't deserve the same protections. They don't have the same ideas of property. And then when the transatlantic slave trade starts, that becomes a way to justify the enslavement of Africans, as that's a different race. And so we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. We'll talk more about this at the end of Unit 3, and we'll read people like Bartolomé de las Casas, who's a Dominican monk from Spain who ends up criticizing this in the middle of the 16th century. And we'll talk a lot about the slave trade in our last museum, talk about African-American history. But it's probably worth at least kind of noting this before we get to the end of the Renaissance and the Reformation. So Sam, speaking of the Reformation, I'm playing Amy in Food Chain in just a few minutes, and I need some help. Besides Martin Luther, can you give me 2 figures from the Reformation that you think I could put in my top 5 most significant people from Unit 2?
Sure. Let me pitch you on two people who are very, very different, but I think very important for shaping the Reformation in their own time and going forward. One of them is John Calvin. And I think why Calvin is sort of a significant person to think about is that Calvin is a theologian, and he's predominantly a theologian. And I think I will say, in my personal experience, I'm going to use a little biography here. Like, I grew up Catholic and then sort of drifted towards Protestantism in a weird kind of way. I came to Bethel, and one of the biggest experiences of change that I went through as I started to encounter Protestants and started to sort of think about how they viewed their faith was that it was so much more through the lens of theology. That I grew up as a person in the church, but I didn't think theologically at all, really, or at least in any kind of systematic way. And Calvin is somebody who's really going to push the Reformation towards systematic theology, towards using that as the lens through which we kind of understand and interpret our faith. The way that we read Scripture, the things we bring to Scripture, the things we take from Scripture. So I think Calvin shapes the Protestant movement in huge ways. So that's one person I'd put on my list. And then another person from the Reformation that I would put on there is someone like Ignatius Loyola, because I think he actually is a really good stand-in for thinking about somebody who is a Catholic Reformation figure who is going to look towards sort of ways maybe the church needs to clean itself up a little bit, but is a staunch defender of the church and is a staunch defender of tradition. And, I always push students when you're reading Loyola and he talks about tradition and talks about the importance of the institution of the church. Tradition to a Catholic reformer is not about this is how we've always done it and we're resistant to change. Tradition is about the fact that for someone like Loyola, there's 1,500 years of Christian scholars. And these folks are going to name them. You're going to see this sort of list of all these other great thinkers, people we've encountered in this course. Aquinas, Augustine, Ambrose, Tertullian. For 1,500 years, people have read the Scriptures and thought about these things. And someone like Loyola is going to look at someone like Luther and say, why are you just throwing out 1,500 years of other Christians, 1,500 years of the history of the faith to say, no, I think I figured it out. And I think that when Loyola is talking about that idea of black and white, that's what he's talking about. He's saying there's a kind of deep humility in there. And I think that's a really significant lens to help us understand people who didn't really accept the Protestant Reformation. And it wasn't because they didn't know about it. It wasn't because they were duped by the church into thinking this other ways. They're thinking for themselves and saying, I don't know, how do I know that your views are right? Maybe I should be thinking about this broader tradition. So those would be the two people that I would say you should think about. Chris, one person that I didn't say, but I want to sort of push back to you is that if we, as students went through the Reformation Museum, the last thing they encountered is something called pietism. Now, I don't know if this is something you've heard of before, but I know since you teach this course, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, hey, can you tell us anything about pietism?
Yeah, no, I can say one or two things. I mean, it's interesting you end, Sam, talking about Loyola and the power of tradition. I think that is something Protestants tend to be skeptical of and suspicious of. And there's almost the sense like our job is to reinvent the faith every so often and to constantly make things new. And I get that. I'll come back to that in a sec. But I think it is important to understand where we come from. I mean, as we get into the end of Unit 2, beginning of Unit 3, I think this is often the experience many of us have as individuals in CWC, whether we're teaching the class or students. And we start to hear our story a little bit more. And this is always where I start to hear my story, partly with Martin Luther, but especially once we get to pietism. This is really where my home denomination, the Covenant Church, comes from, is the pietist movement. I guess what I want to underline is this is where Bethel comes from, too. There are like 4,000 colleges, universities, and seminaries in this country. There are like 24 private colleges in this state, and there are 4 evangelical colleges in the Twin Cities. What makes Bethel different? This is the single biggest difference. There are hardly any other places in the world that would identify as pietist. And so a lot of what I've done in the last 15 years really at Bethel has been to think about what are those differences. And so I think there's something powerful about learning from that tradition and living into it, not meaning that you're bound to it in some way. I think sometimes at Bethel, this turns into, we have to be Swedish somehow, which I think is pretty destructive and for a lot of people alienating at Bethel. But I think there's a kind of living tradition of pietism that's good to go back to. So 2 things I would just say, which I might have talked about in the museum, but things that are on my mind right now. As much as I just talked about the value of tradition, I think one powerful thing about pietism is the idea that you can't just kind of like, Christianity doesn't stop at a certain point. We don't stop at, okay, here are the 12 articles of a creed, we're done, we don't do theology anymore. Or here's the institution, we stop building. And pietism is saying, like, those things can be great and helpful, but they can also, to use a word I used before, be stifling. Or they can enshrine things that are mistaken, or they might have been useful at one point, but not useful anymore. Pietism does have this kind of innovative streak to it. And I think that starts with, pietism always goes back to the Bible. And one of my favorite lines in the Pietist tradition is from the 1960s in the Covenant Church, that the Bible is this altar where we encounter the living God. It is not simply a text. It is not just a bunch of rules. It's not just information, but it's actually the chief way that God mediates his relationship with us. And if that's true, we should not just kind of keep the Bible as this thing that we just use to defend positions we hold, but it's something we keep coming back to, and maybe we're challenged by. Maybe God does something new through our encounter with him in Scripture, and I think that's a very pietist idea. But the problem with that, and with kind of Protestantism generally, is if that's your authority, we're just going to disagree constantly. Because it's a very personal thing to encounter God in Scripture, and if there's no other authority, how do you settle those debates? And I think the remedy then from pietism is to say, let's not have needless controversy. Let's actually learn how to live together even when we disagree. And that's not always a very Protestant or Catholic kind of instinct. And I think that's really powerful right now. So that Bethel is a place where you can actually fundamentally disagree about things and still be in a community centered on Jesus Christ. And so I don't know that's only pietists would do that, but I think that's something we get from that tradition. Exam 2, just to wrap up this first segment, then we'll do some more review of Unit 2. Exam 2 is tomorrow. Amy, before we go, any words of advice as students prepare to take the second exam? Anything you want to reiterate from the first exam? Anything new that we should be thinking about here?
I'm going to go back to what Sam said in our last webisode about like sort of what went well in reflecting on the exam, which is that people did manage their time well. So do it again. Manage your time well. Think about having an approach to the exam. Do not spend 90% of your time working on all of the objective. And then when it comes to the subjective pieces, feel the pressure of running out of time as you're trying to compose those. I could tell in certain students' responses that you had like prepared in advance by following that advice of look at the thematic questions, treat them like an essay question. How long does it take you to compose a decent answer to one of those? Maybe outline those in advance. There's a difference between outlining information and then just pulling information from the internet. So remember that these are your words and be thoughtful with that. I think Unit 2, we tend to sometimes see a little bit of a slide just because on the one hand, the advantage is you've taken one, you've seen what it's like, you kind of know what you're getting into. The flip side of that sometimes can be you've seen what it's like, you know what you're getting into. And so you can kind of put it off a little bit, not spend as much time in preparation. So I just want to sort of put the warning out for that as well. We've done this for so long. There's something that happens in the month of July. We get a little bit busier. Maybe you're at the cabin with family. You're doing this, that, and the other thing. And so in some respects, the content actually, I think, is the easiest to grasp in a way, which is both it's positive and it's negative because you maybe feel like you have more of a handle on it, which I think you probably do, but you still need to do your due diligence with being prepared. So I challenge you to think of this as like, man, I'm going to, I do feel more confident in knowing the system and feeling like I have a handle on how the information and what it means. So like knock it out of the park then. So just kind of keep on doing what you're doing.
And one thing to remember is that there might be a few terms from Unit 1 showing up. We do carry over some mastery terms a date or two, so you probably don't need to do a lot of work there, but don't completely forget Unit 1. It might show up in some connections. Or
I would say really listen to, again, I always think the webisodes are really useful for review because we don't pull things out of obscurity. I mean, we don't pull out things from Unit 1 that aren't going to make any sense. I mean, listen to our conversations. We continue to talk about the importance of ancient Greek philosophy, the influence that Plato and Aristotle have on future thinkers, on artists, on theologians. We talk about within the just the development of Christianity, how one Christian thinker is going to contribute to the later thoughts and writing of another Christian thinker. So, the things we pull out are not obscure. They make sense, but because they make sense, they're often things that we've talked about and addressed together. So we will come back for Unit 2, where I am just particularly excited about the game this week. So we'll be right back.
All right, welcome back for segment 2. We're going to do my favorite thing, which is play a game of food chain. We're going to be talking about who the 5 most significant figures from Unit 2 are, and I get to sit this one out. I get to watch. So this is going to be Gehrz and Poppinga facing off. We're going to start with Dr. Gehrz. Who is number 5 on your list?
Well, let me preface by saying that I think mostly as I was thinking about my top 5, I was thinking about connections between units 1 and 2. I'm thinking about continuities and how the story continues or modifies. But let me start with someone who's a fundamental discontinuity, someone who is radical for his time, really setting up unit 3, and that's Machiavelli. We don't talk a ton about politics and government in this class, although we start with politics and law and justice. And I think in the Middle Ages, there's this pretty pervasive idea that the government, the legal system should be incorporate Christian values and Christian ethics. And you see that even in Erasmus's response to Machiavelli, this idea that the Christian prince should be the image of a God who's both great and good. But that is not how we tend to think about politicians now, right? That's not how we tend to think about the nature of the legal system, how lawmaking works, right? It's more like it's how you make a sausage, right? You don't want to know how it happens because it's so ugly. That's a Machiavellian idea, that politics is fundamentally about power, not about justice, not about morality. And for better or worse, I mean, we can argue the benefits of this, but I think as we start to pivot towards the modern age, Machiavelli is our clearest example of how the Renaissance is moving us in a more modern direction, even though what he's really saying is he would fundamentally disagree with the idea of individual equality and freedom. He doesn't care about the masses. That's going to come later, but he does have this sense of we're not bound by tradition. We're not guided by the church or controlled by the church. And we're not even guided by the values of Christian ethics, at least in the political realm. And that's a pretty important break with what we've seen throughout most of Unit 2.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Chris has had to say there about Machiavelli, because again, reading everything through like the current lens, I just sort of like revisiting our Machiavelli has so much resonance for right now, and understanding different approaches to power and different approaches to like, how do you govern a population of dissenting opinions and dissenting voices, and sort of this idea of like, how do we sort of, I mean, you see it from all sides. Some make the argument, this is how we care for the greater good. Others say this is who gets overlooked when depending upon who's defining what the greater good is. To also preface my list, I usually make lists chronologically. That's kind of usually how I think about this. But today I'm going to kind of depart from that, partially so it makes sense in response to your choices, Dr. Gehrz, but also a product of the Renaissance. And I think akin to what you just said about Machiavelli in terms of like what the Renaissance produced in terms of the ways that people were thinking about power, a counter figure, but just as central, is Erasmus. And so Erasmus, he it's not by coincidence that Erasmus titles one of his most important works, The Weapons of a Christian Warrior. He's saying like, here's an answer to what Christian leadership should look like. These are the things that somebody who holds like Christian values and God's authority as fundamental in every level of who they are, which is not segmented off into like my personal life, my private life. These things go together. And in this concept of the Renaissance, we again are like living out our values and what we believe like authoritative hierarchy to be in everything that we do. That Erasmus makes the argument that, we need prayer and we need knowledge. And these two things go together, that we seek God's authority. We seek to have our actions and behaviors line up with who we know God to be, what he asks of us. And we do that through the pursuit of knowledge. this idea of the importance of study and the importance of not only like theological type of studying the scriptures, what do the scriptures tell us about who we should be, but also the importance of studying secular authors. Like Erasmus wouldn't tell you not to read Machiavelli. He'd be like, no, go read it. Because actually what I'm saying over here isn't going to make as much sense if you don't go read that. So you need to read that to understand where Machiavelli is coming from. And then I'm going to give you the counter argument. But my counter argument isn't going to be made by sort of saying what he's saying isn't true. Erasmus is saying, I understand that's how people think. I understand that is how like a human can approach power. Here's where we're called to be different. Here's where we push back against that. And I'm also going to use Erasmus on my list to try to sum him up really quickly. I'm just going to put it out there. Luther's not on my list. All right. Now, how do you make a Middle Ages, list without Luther? Well, you put Erasmus in there. So yes, it is a little bit like going to the restaurant and every restaurant menu has a hamburger, right? Like everyone does. We find it first. It tells us a little bit about what's going to be on the rest of that menu. It helps our kids eat at every restaurant that we might stop at, and it's essential. But at the same time, you move on and you say, what's even better than the hamburger? The buffalo chicken sandwich. And that's where Erasmus kind of comes in here, because the thing is that we always make this statement. I don't even know who to attribute it to, so tell me if you do, but that like Luther hatches the egg that Erasmus laid. We have no Luther without Erasmus, but Erasmus is very different, and he's going to help me kind of connect to somebody I'm going to bring in here in just a minute. And that like Erasmus wants to what Professor Mulberry said in our previous segment. People who wanted to remain within the structure of the Catholic Church, what was, what we would come to call like the Catholic Church in contrast to the Protestant tradition, we're not saying we're doing everything right. They were saying like, we know we need reform, but we don't think we need to completely start over. And one of the central reasons that we don't want to do that is because who gets hurt in the process? Is what we will lose, and is who will get hurt in that process too much of a cost for completely starting over new? So I'm sure we will get a little bit more into the Erasmus Luther thing. So I'm going to throw it back to you, but I'm using Erasmus not only as like a counterpoint to Machiavelli, representing a lot of the same kind of what's happening in society, but also to bring in this, what will become this Reformation that will split us into two different traditions.
So just to be clear, is Erasmus the buffalo chicken sandwich or the hamburger? I missed that.
Well, I think Erasmus is the buffalo chicken sandwich. I know that doesn't really make sense because that often doesn't come before the hamburger, but my point is like, yeah. Who makes a list without Luther? I get it. He's got to be on there. I'm going to put him on the menu, but
Okay, we'll come to the Luther burger soon enough. I'm glad you talked about Erasmus because he's my personal favorite member of the cloud of witnesses in CWC, and I just realized I left him off the list. So I'm glad you just said everything about him. This actually works well as a segue to my number 4 figure, because Erasmus is educated by and relies on the intellectual resources of monastics. And he never really is committed to the monastic life himself. He never lives for very long in the cloister, but he is one example of the legacy of Benedict of Nursia. And so having started with the Renaissance, I'm going to go then all the way back to the 6th century, the early Middle Ages, and this figure who helps us transition out of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and gives us first kind of medieval habitation, which is not for most people, but it's something like 5% of the medieval population is a monastic of some sort. And that really starts with Benedict. And as some students wrote about earlier in the unit, he's very different than Anthony and the Desert Fathers and Mothers. He's much more deeply committed to community, much more moderate way of disciplined life. And it has enormous consequences, but they're kind of hard to see. This is not a political star. This is not someone who leaves behind an artistic legacy that we can see. We don't even know, he's almost a kind of legendary figure. We don't even know that he really wrote the Rule of St. Benedict. But again, I was thinking about him because I'm doing this Charles Lindbergh book, and this is the last time I'll mention him this episode. But I was going through it again because I have to turn into the publisher this week, and I could not believe the number of times some kind of monastic legacy came up in this story. For example, at the end of his life in the 1970s, Charles Lindbergh starts spending time at a Benedictine convent in Connecticut, whose head is named Mother Benedict. She was an American doctor who converted, and that was the name she took. And Lindbergh's kind of big spiritual breakthrough was he encountered a man who'd been educated by the Jesuits, Ignatius Loyola's order, which was a later monastic offshoot of what Benedict had started. And that's a very odd example, but I think like you'd be astonished like how many times a monastic community or a monastic figure is shaping intellectual life or educational life or cultural life as we continue the story, even centuries after the early Middle Ages. And so like I kind of want to use him as a stand-in for lots of other monastics, whether it's Hildegard of Bingen or Teresa of Avila or Ignatius himself. Like in the West, it really does start with Benedict of Nursia. So he's my number 4.
Interestingly, Benedict is my number 4 as well. So for several of the reasons that you have already stated. And so I want to take what you said, but I'm going to add to it a little bit because the reasons that I chose him to are some concentric circles around what you have already said. So also because, again, of this hinge figure, also because, or rather I want to add to, because yes, like the Benedictine model gives us a new form of living in Christian community. So again, in this contrast to, as you were saying, with like what we see with Anthony with desert monasticism, which is this moving away from and retreating from not because of, and let's remember, students, not because like of persecution, but rather because like I don't like the way Christianity looks here. It's become too easy. It's become too convenient, and I need to draw a contrast between myself. Very individualistic. I'm not critiquing that. I'm just saying though, there was not a notion of like how do we care for community in desert monasticism. And what we see with the model that Benedict creates is a sanctuary in the midst of crisis. And sanctuary is not meant to be taken as like an easy life or a life that was plush or safe even. We know that monasteries were not always protected and safe places, but they were places that were established to be able to live a life in service to God and in service to community, and to provide what was desperately needed, which was a sense of safety, security, and structure. And that idea of like, how do you build up from the rubble something that is consistent, something that is routine, something that creates solidarity. And I always think like harmony is kind of a little bit of a tricky word because it doesn't mean that there was not conflict, but at the same time, something sort of stayed and true that not only was of service like both physically and spiritually to the people who, you know, were members of monastic communities, but also the role that it served to take care of the community around it through providing shelter, through providing food, through providing education, and actually remaining in place as what will be kind of the keepers of the intellectual tradition of Christianity through a really difficult time. So, you know, Benedict stands out for this. And then, as you said, I mean, moving on up until now, we still see different yet same manifestations of the Benedictine model, which I just think is like so cool.
Well, I mean, as usual, we get so excited about our 5th and 4th. We spend lots of time, though. We've got about 6 minutes left to get through our last 3. So I'll try to be short and talk about number 3, who is a monastic, but leaves monasticism, and that's Martin Luther. So I want so badly to put Erasmus here, but this is not the best people of Unit 2. This is the most significant people of Unit 2. And I think Martin Luther is unavoidably, and probably not necessarily to the better, far more significant, not just for the church. Because Erasmus doesn't win, right? I mean, many people remain Catholic because of the impulses you described, but many do not. And the fact that we're at a Protestant university here in the 21st century, and there are more Protestants than Catholics in this country, that is a legacy of Martin Luther. And even outside of religion, Luther is a significant figure because, in a sense, like, he maintains continuity. He revives the thought of Augustine. He revives Augustine's ways of thinking about sin and salvation. But he's also breaking. Like, we're getting these first inklings of the individual conscience is what matters more than, say, institutions or collective stability, right? That's a very modern idea, and it's kind of destructive, but it's certainly a very understandable one for Americans. And he's introducing some other really damaging trends we'll talk about later, like anti-Semitism, which has been there throughout the Middle Ages, but Luther is a really key figure in German history in integrating German nationalism with anti-Semitism. So not necessarily for good reasons, but for some good reasons too. I do think Martin Luther is a pretty significant figure as we get to the end of Unit 2.
Yes, for sure. And I'm going to I'm going to accept your argument, and I'm going to come back to it with my very last one. So this is going to be a little bit of a weird segue into my very quick choice here, but I need to bring in Muhammad. And I don't bring in Muhammad because I'm a scholar of Islamic studies. I bring in Muhammad for many of the reasons that we discussed in our last webisode, which is the fact that like we're never in a vacuum. That this is not, that you just talked a little bit about Luther and issues with anti-Semitism, and there's a lot to unpack there. But one of the things that just even the brief mention of it reminds us of is that like not everyone is the same. Not everybody is living this sort of like harmonious Christian life. And there is most definitely, although privilege would not really have been a word used at the time, there is a privileging of certain religious experiences. And this is a Christian society. And yet at the same time, at the southern end of the, of Christendom, we have the Islamic Empire, and within, like, we talked about this, but like within Spain, I don't want to say a lot about it, but we have communities where you have Islam, or you have Muslims and Christians and Jews interacting, getting along, as well as having conflict, who's in power, who's subjugating the other together. And certainly it's the case, as we see in the work of Thomas Aquinas, who is heavily influenced by Islamic philosophers. There is an interaction that is existing, even though it's hard for us to see it. It's hard for us to look back and to really easily be able to see the evidence of that. But I have to bring in Muhammad because it is during the same time period, like not all that far away, and the evidence of it is within Europe as well, that you have the rise of this major empire that will become the world's second largest religion, and today the fastest growing. And so I feel like I can't just, it was hard to bring it in, but I needed to make mention of that.
Oh, I can't disagree. In fact, Muhammad is number 2 on my list for all the reasons you just spoke to. All I'll add here is that one temptation of Unit 2 and the CWC story is to think, oh, Christianity and Western culture are synonymous at this point. And that's certainly how a lot of Europeans think. But Muhammad stands in as a reminder that Western culture continues on in other forms detached from Christianity, although in conversation with Christianity. That Islamic culture is an heir to some of the same Greek and Roman and other kind of Unit 1 Western cultural values and practices and beliefs, as much as medieval Christendom is. And so I'm not the one who should tell you why Muhammad is important. Amy just did. I guess I'd even put him a little bit higher because of that reminder. Who's your number 2, Amy?
Well, my number 2 is, this could have been a couple of different people, but I went ahead this time and I decided to go with Leonardo da Vinci. So as much as I kind of wanted to make like Erasmus just sort of like all encompassing of the Renaissance and be like my big Renaissance person, I think it's pretty important to recognize the contributions of people like Leonardo da Vinci, and I could have put Michelangelo on here as well for, again, it's not just about like being a good artist. For Leonardo da Vinci, it was like his amazing scientific experimentations. Chris, let's talk about, understanding flight and how that eventually will work. Like, I'll be the one to make the Lindbergh reference.
Thank you.
But again, that is, and this has had staying power, and it's the work of Leonardo da Vinci. And also what people, I think, overlook sometimes, but we as Christians should really kind of go, that's super interesting. People who believed in God, who, like we're living in this culture where they were saying, gosh, I think about these Platonic ideals, and what that should look like, and how we hold up this period for the tremendous achievements. And he's the perfect like il uomo universale. I mean, he's achieving in multiple areas to see just how far can you push human potential. All right, so who's your number 1?
I have a feeling maybe we have the same one, but we'll see. I said Thomas Aquinas, and I said that partly because I tend to be the person on the team who maybe minimizes the importance of philosophy and theology and wants to talk about social history and political history. But if we think about what is the greatest legacy of the Middle Ages, it's not necessarily a Gothic cathedral, beautiful as those are. It's not necessarily the university even. If we want an example of this medieval confidence that Christians can seek after God's truth, synthesize multiple sources, whether it's Aristotle or philosophy mediated through Muslim sources in the case of Thomas Aquinas, and still have an enduring, living, fruitful legacy. Like to this day, Thomistic philosophy is one of the most important branches of philosophy and Catholic theology. Thomas Aquinas is a pretty remarkable figure. And if we're thinking about like who's someone students should admire and learn from, I think Erasmus is right there. I think Thomas Aquinas as much as anyone. This idea that learning, whether it's about God or God's creation, whether it's natural law or divine law, is an act of worship, is something I hope every Bethel student reflects on. It's something I had never considered until I took CWC, and I think about it constantly now. And I don't always pray before I start writing or researching or teaching, but I often do. And it's my little tribute to Thomas Aquinas. And so I've got to put him up there, partly just as a corrective to my own bias against philosophy and theology.
I think that's an excellent choice. I struggled with like trying to figure out where to put Thomas Aquinas on my list. And for me, I was like, I got to get Benedict in here, and I always have to have my Erasmus. And so like I affirm everything you said. And I think that's probably where it's like not a good strategy to be like, here's why you should win. But Aquinas, Chris, don't do it because of Luther. Do it because of Aquinas. I can live with that as a loser. But who I am just going to finish up with here and actually build a little bit on what you said about Aquinas. But the number one thing I want to say in addition just about Aquinas super quickly is just the whole idea of our work and study and knowledge as like a form of praise to God. Like that has been fundamental to me. And you just sort of referenced that in terms of really like setting into work that I'm about to do, particularly work that is difficult, work that maybe just I feel is a burden. And how can I approach it from a place of thinking of it as like a form of praise, a form of like interaction with God. And so, but thinking about other ways to interact with God, to recognize God's activity all around us, but particularly personally and in our hearts and minds for me is the figure of Teresa of Avila. I don't know why I called her a figure because she's a real person. But Teresa becomes, again, another person who Sam in the first part of the webisode talked about all of these things he loves about Loyola. Well, I love Loyola too. And I love Teresa, though, for the exact same reason. So we can save time by saying, go back and listen to everything that Sam said about Loyola and now put it into what, if I could make a longer argument about Teresa of Avila. But like, you know, you've got Erasmus and then you've got Luther, and Erasmus is like, you know, Luther runs one way and Erasmus tries to stop him. And then Teresa says, send him down this tunnel. I'll beat him up right here. Because that is, Teresa is deeply annoyed with Luther and is highly critical of him. And, you know, I like that because I think it's impressive that a woman could be a critic in this particular point in history. And so Teresa is important for many reasons. All the things Sam said, holding up the importance of tradition, not being afraid of reform, but saying reform from within is different from blowing up and completely starting over. Her emphasis on the notion of like personal interaction with God, that like God sees us, God, the Holy Spirit speaks to us. It's transformative. Not only is it like figuratively transformative, it's an actually embodied like physical experience of transformation. But then really finally, because of the Catholic tradition will continue to make a place for female authority figures, that no, women cannot be priests. At the same time, women are esteemed as saints. Their writing remains important. Their voices remain important. I could have put Hildegard of Bingen on here and kind of made some of the same comments for an earlier point in the Middle Ages, but we're not going to study a bunch of women in the emerging Protestant tradition. I don't see it as a welcoming space for women. And so there will still continue to be a voice for women. And we look at the monastic movements that have been essential in moving forward in history because of women. And that is still an important place, especially as our story goes on, for what women within the Catholic tradition will do to really like elevate and empower social justice movements. So I've got to like put my Teresa on there as not a token female figure, but a really essential one in this argument.
All right, two really great lists. I don't know how I would decide. I'm surprised we have two lists that are this different looking at this unit, but this was really helpful for thinking about preparing for the test. Students, go on to Moodle. You can vote for who you think has the better list. I have no idea who's going to win this. We're going to be right back after a short break to finish up this webisode. All right, guys, we got to do this quick. It is happy time. Starting off, happy birthday to the French Republic, whose citizens tore down a prison called the Bastille on this day in 1789. Chris, if and when the EU lets Americans back in, why should students take a chance and visit your favorite European country?
One word, escargot. I never had them. And then we were in Normandy last year, and I got this kind of sampler platter at a restaurant, and I had snails for the first time, and they were pretty fantastic. I kidding.
One of the great countries, in the world, and that's what you pick, Chris? Come on.
I have too much to say, and we have no time in which to say it. Happy anniversary to the exhibit of the industry of all nations. The first World's Fair hosted in the United States started today in 1853 in New York City. Amy, how excited would you be if Minneapolis and St. Paul hosted a World's Fair? / is this a thing we should bring back?
Not excited at all. I've actually long thought that World's Fairs are dumb. I think they're boring to study. I don't really think they've contributed a whole lot. I'm not even a fan of the State Fair. Yep, I know it's a controversial thing to say. I'll tell you, when it got canceled, I'm a teeny bit relieved to get that time back from my life this year. If you think about it, the Minnesota State Fair is the perfect example of like passive-aggressive Minnesota nice. Whole bunch of people getting together, but not actually interacting with anyone that they don't really know. So no World's Fair. Not interested. Okay.
Well, I know what we're going to talk about in the next webisode.
That's fine. You know what? My family actually eats escargot every Christmas Eve. All right. So Cole loves it. It's one of my 13-year-old's favorite things, which is bizarre. But anyway, happy trails to goodbye, Unit 2. Sam, what are you most looking forward to about Unit 3?
I love the fact that in Unit 3, students are going to get to see history that connects really close. We're going to basically build big chunks of the world that we live in. For better and for worse, we're going to understand a lot more about the specifics of the modern world, the contemporary world, by looking at things like the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and moving us all the way into the 20th century. And I think that's really fun to be able to take students on this full ride and get them connected to what we're doing now. One thing that's probably gets invented in Unit 3, that's one of my favorite things at the State Fair, and it's the only reason I disagree with what you had to say, Amy, is I can't go see seed art anywhere else but the State Fair, and seed art is one of my favorite things. Guys, that is all the time we have for today's show. Students, you don't have an assignment for tomorrow, so no Flipgrid. Spend your time studying. Any last minute advice for the exam?
I just want to
have an assignment. It's to take the test. I don't have an assignment for today.
That's true. And just so you know, all of those things we're going to study in Unit 3, just so you're aware, the 1853 World's Fair, not one of them, because it's dumb and it doesn't matter.
Well, I'm glad we included that seed art room in the last museum. That was controversial at the time, but Sam insisted on it.
That's true.
Okay, Sam, take us away.
All right. Well, good luck studying for the test. I know you're going to do great. And we'll close the show by saying good night, Stacy.